unaware she just signed a $1 billion deal. Husband serves wife divorce papers minutes after she births twins, but he forgot to read the prenup. He didn't wait a day. He didn't wait an hour. He didn't even wait 15 minutes. Minutes after Grace Whitmore gave birth to twins, her body still bleeding, stitches fresh, hands shaking as she tried to hold both babies against her chest, her husband walked into her hospital room with another woman at his side and a thick envelope in his hand. Daniel Whitmore didn't smile. He didn't touch his children. He looked straight at his wife and said, in a cold, clear voice, "You're not my problem anymore." "You've been dead weight for years, Grace." The nurse froze in the corner. Grace blinked, trying to focus, trying to understand. Her voice came out small. "Daniel, I just had your babies." He scoffed. "Don't start crying," he snapped. "You're a burden, a liability. You should be grateful anyone married you at all." By the door, his mother, Margaret, stared at Grace like she was dirt on the floor. "She planned this pregnancy to trap you," Margaret said loudly. "Go live like the poor woman you were before my son saved you." The other woman, Natalie, the mistress now standing where a wife should stand, watched with a faint smile. "For success, darling," she said softly to Grace. "Something you clearly don't understand." Grace's arms tightened around the tiny bodies pressed to her chest. On the tray beside her, the divorce papers waited. What Daniel didn't know was this. Just hours earlier, in a quiet consultation room down the hall, Grace had signed a different set of papers, a licensing deal that quietly valued her work at $1 billion. And buried in the prenup he once laughed at and never truly read, was a clause that would turn this moment against him in a way he never saw coming. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you watch without subscribing, it's like letting Grace's strength be ignored the way they ignored her in that hospital room. When you click that button, you stand with every woman who was humiliated at her weakest and still chose to rise. Please, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Grace Whitmore was 32 years old, 8 months pregnant with twins, and standing in her own kitchen as if she were waiting for permission to exist. The intensity came immediately sharp and suffocating. "Look at you," Margaret Whitmore said, her voice slicing through the room. "You've really let yourself go." Margaret Whitmore was Daniel's mother, 61, controlled, immaculately dressed, and used to being obeyed. She believed family was hierarchy, not love. From the first day Grace married her son, Margaret had made it clear. Grace was tolerated, not accepted. Grace froze. Her hand moved instinctively to her stomach, round and heavy beneath her dress. The twins shifted inside her, slow and uneasy, as if they felt what she was feeling. "Twins aren't an excuse," Margaret continued flatly. "A woman should still know her place. Pregnancy isn't permission to become careless." Grace didn't answer. A few steps away sat Daniel Whitmore, her husband of 6 years, 36, ambitious, image-obsessed. He leaned back in his chair at the breakfast bar, eyes fixed on his phone, thumb scrolling through emails, jaw tight with a permanent irritation he no longer tried to hide. He didn't look up. That silence hurt more than the insult. Daniel liked to tell people he had saved Grace, that she had been nothing special before him. That marriage had given her value. He said it often enough at dinners, at work events, sometimes even at home, until it became part of the story he told himself. Grace swallowed. She reminded herself this was temporary. That pregnancy made people harsh. That marriage required patience. That seasons changed. She had always believed sacrifice came back around. "Can you stop standing like that?" Daniel said suddenly, still not looking at her. "You're blocking the light." Grace turned slightly, confused. "I was just—" "Don't start," he snapped. "You're always so emotional. It's exhausting." Margaret nodded approvingly, like a teacher pleased with a student's answer. Grace felt something sink inside her chest, not pain exactly, but weight, a familiar one. She turned toward the counter, pretending to search for something to clean, something to fix, something to make herself useful in a house she helped keep running but had never truly been allowed to own. As she moved, her thoughts slipped backward, pulled into memory. Years earlier, Grace had been someone else. At 26, she had worked as a senior product strategist at a research firm. She was the one who stayed late, the one who fixed problems no one else understood. She didn't talk much about her work because she didn't need praise, results were enough. That's where she met Daniel. He had been charming then. Curious. He asked questions about her work, told her she was brilliant. He said she deserved more than being invisible in someone else's company. She believed him. What Daniel never told anyone, what he later erased, was that Grace didn't lose that career. She walked away from it. Voluntarily. 3 months after their engagement, Margaret had invited Grace to lunch. The restaurant had been quiet, elegant, uncomfortable. "You work too much," Margaret had said calmly. "A wife who works forgets how to support her husband." Grace had hesitated. "I enjoy my work," she had replied carefully. Margaret smiled thin, practiced. "Enjoyment is for hobbies," she said. "Marriage is about priorities." That night, Grace talked to a lawyer for the first time, Evelyn Ross. Evelyn had helped her negotiate her exit from the failing research firm and had quietly advised her to protect the algorithm she had been building there. "You have something valuable," Evelyn had said. "Don't give it away because someone tells you it's just work." Grace registered her intellectual property in her own name before she resigned. She didn't mention that part to Margaret. In the months before the wedding, after their engagement but before they set a date, Grace met with Evelyn again. That was when the prenup came up. It was Grace's idea, not Daniel's. Evelyn drafted it before the marriage, simple, clear, and signed by both of them long before the wedding ceremony. Anything Grace created before or during the marriage remained hers. No spousal claim, no shared ownership of her intellectual property, and a clause Grace insisted on: financial penalties and legal recourse if there was ever coercion, financial control, or abuse. Daniel had laughed when he saw it, skimmed it carelessly, and signed anyway. In the present, she wiped the counter slowly, feeling Daniel's eyes flick up now, assessing, not affectionate. "You know," he said, finally looking at her. "My colleagues keep asking why you never come to events anymore. It's embarrassing." Grace turned. "I'm 8 months pregnant," she said softly. "With twins," Daniel sighed. "Excuses," he muttered. "Other women manage." Margaret smirked. Grace said nothing. She had learned silence kept the peace, or at least delayed the explosion. No one in that room noticed. No one had ever asked how Grace lived quietly alongside them. In the small office upstairs, she kept a separate laptop, always locked, always charged. It wasn't a secret because she was doing something wrong. It was separate because experience had taught her that some things were safer out of reach. She still consulted occasionally on logistics problems for her former industry contacts, all legal, all through a personal company registered in her name years ago. No overlap with Daniel's finances, no joint signatures. She signed documents digitally, using secure apps Evelyn had recommended. Daniel had once asked who kept calling. Grace had smiled and said, "Old work things." He never pressed. Now, standing alone by the counter, Grace felt another small movement inside her. She placed both hands on her belly and closed her eyes. The room faded. The insults, the tension, the quiet cruelty. She leaned forward slightly and whispered, barely audible, "Mama will fix this," she said softly. "I promise." Daniel scoffed behind her. Margaret turned away, uninterested. On the table, half hidden beneath a magazine, Grace's phone lit up with a single unread notification from a secure email account Evelyn had set up for her. Grace didn't reach for it yet. She finished wiping the counter, put the cloth away, and forced herself to breathe. Because somewhere beneath the silence, something irreversible had already begun. And very soon, everything they thought they knew about her would collapse. The pain came suddenly, sharp, tight, unforgiving. Grace Whitmore gripped the edge of the hospital bed as another contraction rolled through her body, stronger than the last. Her breath caught. The room felt too small, too quiet, too empty. She was alone. Daniel had dropped her off an hour earlier after the obstetrician suggested she stay for monitoring. He stood at the foot of the bed for less than 5 minutes, checked his watch twice, and kissed her forehead like an obligation. "Text me if it gets serious," he'd said. "I have meetings this afternoon. I'll come back when it's time." Margaret had promised to check in later. They hadn't returned. Now Grace sat under dim lights in a private consultation room just off the maternity ward, heart racing, hands trembling not just from pain, but from the weight of everything pressing in at once. Then her phone vibrated. She flinched, thinking it might be Daniel, already annoyed, already distant. But the name on the screen stopped her breath completely. Evelyn Ross. Grace straightened slowly, wiping sweat from her forehead. Evelyn was more than just the lawyer who had drafted her prenup. She had been there the night Grace walked away from her old firm, the one who helped her protect the code she'd written when no one else believed it mattered. Evelyn wasn't family. She wasn't emotional. She never called unless it mattered. Grace answered. Yes, she whispered. Evelyn's voice was steady on the other end. Professional, controlled. Paper rustled softly in the background. It's done, Evelyn said. Grace's fingers tightened around the phone. The licensing agreement is fully executed, Evelyn continued. Global rollout approved. Final valuation confirmed by Viridian's board this morning. Grace had signed her part of the agreement in that same consultation room earlier that morning, hand trembling slightly as she scrawled her name on the tablet Evelyn's office had sent over. Viridian. The multinational logistics company Grace had been quietly negotiating with for nearly a year. The ones who had approached her after seeing what her algorithm could do in a small pilot. You crossed 1 billion, Evelyn said. The number barely registered. Another contraction rolled through her so hard that the word billion blurred into background noise. Right now, survival felt more real than any valuation. That's their internal valuation of the technology. The first milestone payment is locked. Congratulations. And more importantly, you're officially protected. Grace closed her eyes. Not because she was overwhelmed with joy, but because for the first time in years, she felt something loosen inside her chest. Safety. Not money safety, not status safety, legal safety. Another contraction hit, and Grace inhaled slowly, grounding herself as Evelyn kept speaking. The corporate counsel signed off 20 minutes ago, Evelyn said. Your company retains ownership of the code. Viridian only licenses it. No matter what happens in your marriage, this deal is untouchable. It's in your name alone, consistent with the prenup. Grace nodded, even though Evelyn couldn't see her. Thank you, Grace said quietly. Grace, Evelyn added, her tone shifting just slightly. I saw your missed call from last night. If something is happening at home, document everything. You already know this, but I'm reminding you, the prenup's abuse clause is enforceable. Don't let them bully you into signing anything in your current condition. Grace's throat tightened. I understand. She ended the call just as the pain faded into a dull ache. The room went silent again, and with that silence came memory. Years earlier, long before pregnancy, before cruelty became routine, Grace had been working late in an empty office, staring at lines of code that no one else at the firm seemed to understand. She had noticed inefficiencies in logistics systems that cost companies millions each year, patterns no one bothered to question, so she built something better, a proprietary algorithm. Clean, adaptive, quietly powerful. At first it was just a side project, then it became more. When the firm began to collapse under bad leadership, Grace made a choice. She reclaimed what was hers legally. Her work, her idea, her creation. She registered it under her own name, protected it, refined it slowly while life moved forward around her. She never told Daniel the full scope, not because she was hiding something wrong, but because she had been warned. Margaret's voice echoed in her memory. Men get threatened by women with options, Margaret had said years ago, over tea. If you want peace, don't make him feel small. Grace had listened. She had always listened. The prenup had been Grace's idea too. Evelyn had insisted on specific language. Anything Grace created before or during the marriage remained hers. Any attempt by a spouse to transfer, conceal, or control her intellectual property triggered automatic financial penalties and immediate grounds to seek separate accounts and protection. Daniel had shrugged and signed, convinced he would always be the one holding the power. Now, sitting in a hospital room with her body preparing to split open to bring life into the world, Grace placed a hand on her stomach and breathed through another wave of discomfort. The twins shifted inside her. She whispered, barely audible, I won't let them inherit silence. The door opened briefly. A nurse peeked in, checking the monitor, offering a polite smile before leaving again. Grace was alone once more. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message notification. Not from Daniel, not from family. A secure confirmation email, unread. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Another contraction, surged stronger now, more urgent. Grace pressed the call button for assistance, her breathing steady, her face calm. The nurse returned with the obstetrician. They spoke to her gently, explaining that her labor was progressing faster than expected. The operating room was being prepped just in case. Somewhere else in the building, Daniel was still unaware, still scrolling, still confident, still believing he held all the power. Grace lay back against the pillow, eyes focused on the ceiling as the nurse adjusted the IV. "It's time," the nurse said softly. Grace nodded. As she was wheeled down the hallway, her phone slipped slightly on the bed beside her, screen lighting up one last time. The subject line glowed briefly before the screen dimmed. Confirmation. Final licensing agreement. Executed. Daniel never saw it. And in just minutes he would make the decision that would destroy everything he thought he controlled. He just didn't know it yet. It had been barely 15 minutes since the twins were born when the room changed. The first cry had barely faded when the door opened. Grace Whitmore lay on the hospital bed, drenched in sweat, her body shaking from pain and exhaustion. Her arms trembled as she held her newborn twins against her chest, one wrapped in a pale blanket, the other tucked close beneath her chin. Their tiny faces were red and wrinkled, eyes closed, mouths searching blindly for comfort. She was stitched, sore, exhausted, but she was smiling. For one fragile moment, nothing else existed. Then the door opened. Hard. Daniel Whitmore walked in first. He didn't rush. He didn't smile. He didn't move toward the babies. He looked annoyed. Behind him stepped Natalie Reed, the woman Grace had seen only once before, at a company dinner, introduced as a consultant. Natalie was in her early 30s, polished, confident, dressed too well for a maternity floor. Her hair was perfect, her expression calm, possessive. She stood where a wife should stand. Grace's heart stuttered. A second later, Margaret Whitmore entered behind them. Chin lifted, lips pressed tight with satisfaction. Daniel's mother didn't look at Grace first. Her eyes went straight to the baby's cold, appraising, detached before flicking back up to the room, assessing who was watching. A nurse stood at the monitor, chart in hand. She froze as the energy shifted. Grace tightened her arms around the twins instinctively. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice thin and confused. What is she doing here?" Daniel ignored the question. He stepped closer to the bed and placed a thick manila envelope onto the rolling tray beside Grace's arm. The sound of it hitting the metal surface felt louder than it should have. "Final. You're not my problem anymore," Daniel said flatly. "You've been dead weight for years." The words didn't make sense at first. Grace stared at him, her mind slow, foggy from medication and shock. She looked down at the envelope, then back at his face. "I just gave birth," she said quietly. "They're still." Natalie leaned in slightly, her voice soft, almost gentle. "For success, darling," Natalie said. "Something you wouldn't understand." She smiled as she said it, like she was delivering a line she had rehearsed. Grace's breath caught. Margaret scoffed from the foot of the bed. "She planned this pregnancy to trap you," Margaret said, loud enough that the nurse flinched. "Disgusting." Grace shook her head weakly. "That's not Daniel, please." She tried to sit up, panic cutting through the exhaustion. The movement sent pain ripping through her abdomen. She gasped. The nurse instinctively stepped forward. "Sir, she just came out of surgery," the nurse said carefully. "She needs rest." "This isn't." Margaret turned her head slowly and stared at the nurse. "This is a private family matter," Margaret said. "You're not needed right now." The nurse hesitated, glancing at Grace. Grace managed a small shake of her head, not because she didn't want help, but because she knew what confrontation with Margaret would look like. Not here. Not with her babies in her arms. The nurse lingered by the door, unwilling to leave completely. Daniel didn't help Grace sit up. He didn't ask how she felt. "Don't embarrass me," he snapped. "I need you to sign these so we can both move on." He tapped the envelope. Grace stared at it. "Divorce papers," Daniel said, as if announcing a delivery. "My lawyer already filed. This is just your acknowledgement." Grace looked down at her children. They were warm, real, alive. Her hands were still shaking as she adjusted the blanket around them, shielding them instinctively from the tension in the room. "Why now?" she whispered. "Why here?" Daniel exhaled sharply, irritated. "You've always been a burden," he said. "Always emotional, always in the way. I'm done carrying you." Natalie nodded, satisfied. "You should be grateful," Natalie added. Not every woman gets clarity this early. Grace felt something inside her crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. She had given him years. She had given up her career, she had given birth to his children, and this was how he chose to end it. Her arms tightened around the twins again. Margaret clicked her tongue. "Stop clinging," she said. "You're making a scene." Grace didn't answer. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She just stared at the envelope, then at the blank signature lines she could see through the translucent flap. Daniel shifted impatiently. "Sign it," he repeated. "Or this gets uglier. Lawyers. Depositions. You're not built for that." Grace swallowed hard. The room was silent except for the soft breathing of the babies. Then her phone buzzed on the bed beside her elbow. Once. The sound cut through everything. Grace flinched. Daniel reacted instantly. He reached over and knocked the phone aside without even looking at it. It slid across the sheet and stopped near the edge of the mattress, screen lighting up briefly before dimming again. No one saw the subject line. Confirmation. Final licensing agreement executed. Grace didn't reach for it. She looked at Daniel instead. "I'm not signing anything right now," she said, voice barely above a whisper but steadier than before. "I just had surgery. My lawyer will review it." Daniel's eyes flashed. "You don't have a lawyer," he said. "You have me. Or you did." Grace held his gaze. "I do," she said quietly. "I've had one for years." For the first time, Daniel hesitated. The nurse shifted her weight, stepping closer to the bed again. "I'm documenting this conversation," the nurse said carefully. "It's hospital policy when legal documents are brought into a post-op room." Margaret turned on her sharply. "You people and your policies." Daniel cut her off with a small gesture. He could feel control slipping and didn't understand why. He grabbed the envelope, shoved it back into his briefcase, and snapped it shut. "This isn't over," he said. He turned and walked out. Natalie followed him, heels clicking softly on the floor. Margaret lingered a moment longer, eyes cold. "You brought this on yourself," she said. Then she left. The door closed. Grace was alone again, holding 2 newborn lives against her chest, pain pulsing through her body. The nurse moved quickly now, adjusting the blankets, checking the IV, her professionalism returning. "I'm so sorry," the nurse said quietly. "Do you want me to note everything that just happened?" Grace nodded once, unable to trust her voice. The nurse tapped the tablet, documenting. Outside the room, voices faded. Inside, something else awakened. Grace lowered her forehead to the twins' heads and closed her eyes. Very soon, everything Daniel thought he had ended would only just begin. The card reader beeped once, then again, then a third time, louder, sharper, final. Declined. 3 days after giving birth, Grace Whitmore stood at the hospital pharmacy counter, her body still sore, her arms heavy as she held one twin while the other slept in a carrier at her feet. The discharge nurse had given her a list of medications to fill before she left. The clerk shifted awkwardly, eyes flicking to the babies, then back to the screen. "I'm sorry," the clerk said softly. "It says the account is closed." Grace felt heat rush to her face. "That can't be right," she said, her voice calm but thin. "We've used that card for years. Please try again." The clerk did. The same answer. Behind Grace, through the glass doors, Daniel's car idled in the patient pickup lane. He sat in the driver's seat, sunglasses on, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel. In the passenger seat, Natalie Reed scrolled through her phone, lips curved in a small, pleased smile. Natalie had insisted on coming along when Daniel picked Grace up. "It'll be easier," she'd said. "I can help you carry things while Grace recovers." Now she leaned out the open window slightly when she saw Grace turn back toward the counter. "She spends too much," Natalie said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. "She'll have to learn to budget." People turned. Grace tightened her grip on the baby, feeling the familiar mix of shame and disbelief. She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope of emergency cash she had kept for years, money she'd set aside quietly from small consulting payments long before the licensing deal. She paid the clerk without looking at anyone. Outside, she started recording on her phone before she reached the car. The camera angled down at her feet, the audio clear. "What happened?" Daniel asked as she opened the back door slowly. "The card was declined," Grace said, easing into the seat with a wince. "They said the account was closed." Daniel shrugged, putting the car into gear. "I moved everything," he said. "Joint accounts are a liability in a divorce. My lawyer advised it." "You canceled our medical card while I was still admitted," Grace said softly. You're covered under my insurance, he replied. Stop being dramatic. Natalie smirked, eyes still on her phone. Grace said nothing. She pressed her phone deeper into the diaper bag, letting it keep recording. When they reached the house Daniel had bought 2 years into the marriage, the one he liked to call his, the intensity returned hard and immediate. 2 men stood at the gate. Security. They wore dark uniforms from the private company that patrolled the neighborhood and avoided Grace's eyes. Daniel pulled up, rolled down the window. Afternoon, one guard said carefully. We received new access instructions. Grace frowned. What instructions? She asked. The guard swallowed. Ma'am, he said, we've been told your name was removed from the primary access list. You're not authorized to enter the property without Mr. Whitmore present. Grace blinked. I live here, she said slowly. My children live here. Not for long, came a voice from the front steps. Margaret Whitmore appeared at the door like a commander surveying a battlefield. She didn't look at Grace. She looked at the guards. Follow the instructions you were given, Margaret said. Only Mr. Whitmore and approved guests are allowed through without clearance. Natalie slipped past them, keys to the front door already in her hand. Grace opened the car door, moving carefully, pain flaring through her abdomen as she stepped out with the twin carrier. Daniel, she said. I just had surgery. I need my things. The baby's things, their cribs. Daniel avoided her eyes. You'll have what you need, he said. We'll send essentials to wherever you're staying. This is simpler. I wasn't told I was staying anywhere else, Grace said. Margaret smiled thinly. You'll manage, she said. You managed before my son saved you. Inside, the house moved quickly without Grace. Drawers opened, closets emptied, suitcases dragged across floors. Grace stood at the gate, the twins fussing softly, while her life was sorted without her input. One of Daniel's siblings, his younger brother, Evan, late 20s, always quiet, stood near the walkway. He watched, hands in pockets, saying nothing. Another sibling, Lena, leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on her phone, pretending not to listen. No one defended Grace. No one asked questions. Grace shifted the weight of the carrier and pulled out her phone with her free hand, keeping it low, the screen dark. The audio app she'd opened at the pharmacy was still running. Ma'am, do you have somewhere to go tonight? One of the guards asked quietly when Margaret stepped back inside. Grace nodded, though she didn't. Not yet. Yes, she said. I'll manage. She wouldn't tell them that her somewhere would be a small furnished rental Evelyn had mentioned once, just in case. Natalie reappeared at the doorway wearing Grace's robe, the one Grace wore every morning. Natalie smiled, turning slightly, admiring herself in the reflection of the glass. So this is where we'll live, she said casually. Daniel didn't correct her. Grace felt something detach inside her, not her heart, but something colder, something that watched instead of felt. Her phone buzzed in her hand. Evelyn, Grace answered. Are you safe? Evelyn asked. No greeting, no small talk. Not here, Grace replied. Go to the address I texted you yesterday, Evelyn said. The short-term rental. I booked it in your name. We'll deal with the house legally. Don't argue with them right now. Grace glanced at the gate cameras, the guards, the open front door where her robe now hung on someone else's shoulders. I have the babies, she said. I know, Evelyn replied. That's why I'm telling you not to stand in a driveway arguing with people who want you destabilized. Get somewhere stable. Then we move. Later that night, after she settled the twins and borrowed bassinets in the small rental apartment Evelyn had arranged, Grace received another message. Margaret was hosting a small family gathering and expected Grace to be there to discuss terms like an adult. Evelyn replied first. Go, she texted, and record everything. Grace arrived slowly, exhausted, carrying the twins. The room fell quiet when she entered. Margaret glanced at the chair beside Daniel at the long dining table. Remove that, she said sharply. A cousin hesitated, then picked it up and carried it away. Grace stood. She doesn't belong here, Margaret said, loud enough for everyone to hear. She never did. A phone lifted on the far side of the room. Grace saw the screen glowing, angled toward her. Recording. Daniel didn't look at her. Natalie sat where Grace should have been, one hand resting on Daniel's knee. Grace shifted her weight, pain flaring through her abdomen, but she didn't ask to sit. She didn't ask for anything. She watched. She noticed the way Natalie handled papers, financial documents, casually flipping through them, confident. She noticed Daniel's banking notifications lighting up on his phone, and the way he tilted the screen just enough for Natalie to see. She noticed everything. No one spoke to Grace directly. She was there, but invisible. When the gathering ended, Grace stood near the doorway preparing to leave. Natalie walked past her and kissed Daniel. Slow, deliberate, territorial, in Grace's former living room. Grace didn't cry. She didn't react. She memorized. The way Daniel leaned into it, the way Margaret watched with approval, the way the security guard logged the time at the gate as she left again with her children. As Grace stepped outside, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She didn't check it yet. But she knew without knowing how that everything being taken from her was being documented somewhere else, quietly. And soon, very quietly, the people who erased her would learn what it meant to leave a trail. Because what they thought was the end was only evidence being born. The door closed behind Grace with a soft click. For a moment, the sound felt louder than it should have, final, deliberate, controlled. She stood still, one hand resting on the handle, breathing through the ache in her body. Every movement still reminded her of what she had been through. Surgery, blood loss, sleepless nights, but her grip was steady. The twins slept in their carrier beside her, tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. This was the first quiet she had known in days that wasn't filled with someone else's voice. Grace stepped into the office. It was small, neutral, no personal touches. Just a table, 3 chairs, and a large window that let in afternoon light. The kind of place where decisions were made carefully, with more facts than emotion. At the table sat Evelyn Ross. Evelyn rose when Grace entered, mid-40s, dressed simply, eyes sharp and alert. She had represented Grace for years, first for her intellectual property, then for the prenup, and now, inevitably, for this. "You made it," Evelyn said. Grace nodded and sat down slowly, lowering herself into the chair beside the twins. She adjusted the blanket around them before looking up again. Evelyn didn't rush her. She laid out a thick folder and began spreading documents across the table. Bank statements, legal notices, printed screenshots, security access logs. "They moved faster than I expected," Evelyn said, "but they also made more mistakes than I expected." Grace leaned forward slightly. Evelyn pointed to the first page. "Financial control," she said. "Your cards were canceled while you were hospitalized, and your access to the marital home was removed without any court order. That's documented, time-stamped, violates both standard marital rights and the abuse clause in your prenup." She slid another page forward. "Unauthorized transfers," Evelyn continued. "Marital funds moved to Natalie Reed's personal account, labeled as consulting fees, no contract, no deliverables, no approval from you, despite your prenup requiring mutual consent for large transfers." Grace nodded once. Evelyn placed a third document down. "Coercion," she said. "Divorce papers brought into a post-operative room, witnessed by a nurse. The hospital has already confirmed they have an incident report on file." Grace's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even. "They didn't hide it," she said quietly. "They thought they didn't have to." Evelyn studied her for a moment before speaking again. "You were right to save everything." Grace reached into her bag and placed her phone on the table. She unlocked it, then slid it toward Evelyn, the screen filled with files. Videos, photos, audio clips, security footage of the gate guard telling her she was no longer authorized to enter. A recording of Margaret insisting she never belonged here. Natalie's comment at the pharmacy about learning to budget. Daniel admitting he moved everything out of the joint account. Grace watched Evelyn scroll. She didn't look away. "They thought silence meant weakness," Grace said. It didn't. There was a knock at the door. A man stepped inside briefly, early 40s, plain clothes, alert eyes. "This is Mark Hale," Evelyn said. "Private investigator." He verified the digital evidence and pulled independent logs. Mark nodded to Grace. "We've cross-checked everything," he said. "Security records match your footage. Gate logs, transaction times, staff statements, it all lines up. And one more thing. Daniel and Natalie set up a shell company 3 months ago. Reed Whitmore Analytics. No real product. Just a name that looks close enough to your field to raise eyebrows." Grace's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. "They plan to present your algorithm as theirs, if they could get access," Mark said. Viridian flagged the attempted contact from their end. They forwarded the emails. Viridian already sees them as a risk, Evelyn added. That helps you. A lot. Grace met Mark's gaze. Is it enough? She asked. Mark didn't hesitate. Yes. He stepped back out, closing the door quietly behind him. The room settled again. Grace leaned back in her chair, finally allowing herself to breathe. The twins stirred softly, then went still. She looked down at them. For the first time since the hospital, her eyes softened. This isn't about hurting him, she said. It's about ending it. Evelyn nodded. And making sure it can't be rewritten. Grace lifted her head. They erased me, she said. I want the truth seen. Evelyn gathered the papers into a neat stack. Daniel's petition for divorce is already filed, she said. We're filing a counterpetition and a motion for protective orders today. With this, the court will see the pattern clearly. Financial abuse, coercion, attempts to interfere with your work. Grace exhaled. And the deal? She asked. With Viridian? Untouched, Evelyn replied. Their legal team has already sent a letter confirming the IP is solely yours. Once this goes public, they'll lean into the narrative of backing the woman who built it, not the man who tried to profit off it. Grace looked back at the carrier. The twins slept on, unaware of contracts or courts or betrayal. They won't grow up thinking this is normal, she said. Evelyn's voice softened. No, she said. They won't. Outside, the afternoon light shifted across the floor. Inside, the women at the table organized facts, dates, evidence, not noise, strategy. They wanted you small and dependent, Evelyn said quietly. You're neither. We'll let the law say that out loud. Grace nodded. Then let's start. Because silence had done its job. It had recorded, it had gathered, it had survived. Now, it was ready to speak. A few days later, once everything had been pulled into a clean sequence, the first video started playing without sound. Grace Whitmore leaned forward instinctively, her body tense, eyes fixed on the laptop screen. The twins slept beside her in their carrier on the office floor, tiny hands curled into fists, unaware that their mother was watching the truth assemble itself piece by piece. On the screen, a hospital pharmacy counter, a timestamp in the corner, 3 days after delivery, 10:14 a.m. Evelyn Ross stood behind Grace, arms folded, voice steady. That's the exact minute, Evelyn said. Your primary joint account was shut down. Grace didn't speak. She watched herself on the screen, pale, slow-moving, holding a newborn while a red decline flashed across the terminal. Another file opened. Bank records, clean, precise. Marital funds transferred out in 3 large amounts in the 48 hours before and after delivery. The recipient name repeated each time, Natalie Reed. Consulting. Labeled as consulting expenses, Evelyn said. No contract, no work product, no disclosure to you. That's not consulting. That's siphoning. Grace nodded once. Her face remained calm, but her fingers curled slowly into her palm. The private investigator, Mark Hale, adjusted the laptop angle and clicked to the next clip. This one came from the house security system, he said. Cloud backup. You were still living there when this was recorded. The video began. The kitchen. Margaret Whitmore stood by the sink, sleeves rolled up, face set with purpose. She poured dark, dirty mop water into a bucket, stirring it with a handle. Daniel stood beside her, tense. She needs to learn respect, Margaret said. Take the clean bucket away and give her this. Do it now, before she thinks she still belongs here. The camera angle shifted slightly as a housekeeper stepped into frame, looking uncomfortable. Ma'am, she's pregnant, the housekeeper said quietly. The doctor told her not to. Margaret cut her off. Then she can sit and watch as we go through her things, she said. Either way, she'll understand this isn't her home. The clip ended. The room was silent. Evelyn lowered herself into the chair across from Grace. This isn't just unkind, Evelyn said. This shows a pattern. Humiliation, control. You were pregnant with twins when this was recorded. The timestamp puts it at 6 months. Grace stared at the blank screen. For years, she had been told to endure, to stay quiet, to make things easier. Now silence was finally speaking for her. Mark placed another file on the table. Former staff came forward once your counterpetition was filed, he said. They were afraid of losing their jobs before. Now they're not. These are their statements. He slid over written declarations, short, factual, unemotional. Grace read them slowly. Dates, orders, witness behavior. One line stood out. Mr. Whitmore instructed us not to acknowledge Mrs. Whitmore's presence in front of guests. One statement read. He said it would confuse the hierarchy. Grace's throat tightened. Evelyn tapped the next folder. There's more, she said. Grace looked up. Evelyn opened it carefully, revealing photographs taken by fire inspectors from the security company that maintained the house's alarm system. Burnt paper fragments, charred edges, part of an envelope seal. A sealed legal letter, Evelyn said. Destroyed in the Whitmore kitchen trash 3 weeks before the birth. Grace's eyes sharpened. That letter, Evelyn continued, was the original hard copy from Viridian's legal department, confirming your exclusive ownership of the algorithm and the valuation metrics they used. Their office sent it by courier and got a delivery confirmation. It never reached you. Mark nodded. The housekeeper reported a fancy legal letter arriving that day, he said. She says Natalie picked it up and said, "This doesn't matter anymore," and then later she saw burnt paper in the trash. The fire inspector confirmed the remains are consistent with the courier stationery. Grace inhaled slowly. Natalie hadn't just humiliated her. She had tried to erase proof of Grace's ownership before the deal was finalized. Grace reached into her bag and removed a slim folder of her own. She placed it gently on the table. I kept digital backups, she said. Emailed versions, scanned drafts. Viridian's counsel resent everything to my secure account. Evelyn smiled faintly. I assumed you did. The videos continued. A nurse's incident report from the hospital. Daniel delivering divorce documents to a post-operative room. Margaret ordering the nurse to leave. Grace clearly stating she would not sign without her lawyer. Gate logs from the house. Grace's access removed on the same day. Daniel texted his lawyer about getting her out before she realizes what we moved. And then another layer. This is where it gets interesting, Mark said, opening one more file. Daniel's workplace. A series of emails flashed on the screen. Daniel and Natalie, using company emails and letterhead, pitching Reed Whitmore Analytics to Viridian as a streamlined solution for logistics optimization. They attached vague descriptions, no working prototype, but the language mirrored Grace's early pitch decks almost word for word. They tried to get a separate meeting, Mark said. Viridian's general counsel flagged it as a conflict and forwarded everything to Evelyn. Evelyn didn't hide her satisfaction. They thought you were alone, she said. You weren't. Grace watched it all with a strange calm. She wasn't reliving pain, she was mapping it. At one point, Mark looked up from his notes. We've already turned this over to a forensic accountant, he said. The court will see the money trail. The regulators will see the attempted shell company. Your prenup's abuse provisions will hold. Grace glanced down at her children again. She adjusted the blanket around them, smoothing it carefully. They won't grow up thinking this is normal, she said. Evelyn's voice softened. No, she said, they won't. The sun dipped lower outside the window, casting long shadows across the office floor. Mark closed his laptop. We have enough, he said simply. Evelyn nodded. More than enough, she echoed. From this point forward, we don't just defend, we set the record. Grace looked at her reflection in the dark laptop screen. This was supposed to be quiet, she said. He wanted me to disappear. Evelyn met her gaze. Do you want this to end quietly, she asked, or do you want the truth on record, where it can't be spun later? Grace didn't answer right away. She watched the twins breathe, the rise and fall of their tiny chests. Then she nodded. We go public, she said. And somewhere, not yet aware, Daniel was still standing on ground that was already breaking beneath him. He just hadn't felt it move yet. The courtroom doors swung open with a sharp echo. Weeks had passed since Grace left the house. Enough time for filings, responses, and arguments on paper. Not enough time for Daniel to understand what he was walking into. Daniel Whitmore walked in first. His posture was confident, shoulders back, chin lifted like a man who believed he still owned the room. He wore a tailored suit, expensive watch, polished shoes. He looked calm, almost bored. At his side sat Natalie Reed, legs crossed neatly, nails perfect, lips curved into a controlled half-smile. She scanned the courtroom as if it were just another meeting she expected to win. Behind them, Margaret Whitmore took her seat, spine straight, eyes cold. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered without concern for anyone else hearing. "She'll fold," Margaret said. "She always does." Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. He believed her. Then the room shifted. Grace Whitmore entered last. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She walked in slowly, carefully, her posture calm, her face composed. She wore a simple dress. No jewelry meant to impress. She wasn't trying to look powerful. She already was. The press noticed first. Then the observers. A low murmur moved through the room as Grace took her seat beside Evelyn Ross, her lawyer. Daniel glanced back. For the first time, his expression tightened. Grace didn't look at him. The judge, an older man with a steady voice and sharp eyes, called the court to order. Papers were passed forward. Silence fell. The judge adjusted his glasses and began reading from the document at the heart of the case. The prenuptial agreement, page by page, line by line. Daniel's lawyer shifted in his seat. The language was clear, precise, unavoidable. Clause 1. All intellectual property created by or belonging to Grace Whitmore before or during the marriage remains her sole property. Clause 2. No spouse may claim ownership, partial or otherwise, of said intellectual property, regardless of marital assets. Clause 3. Any attempt to coerce, control, or financially sabotage the protected party triggers automatic financial penalties, including reimbursement of diverted funds and coverage of legal fees. Clause 4. In the event that abuse is documented by third-party evidence, such as medical reports, financial records, or witness statements, the protected party may seek separate residence, sole management of her income, and primary custody without financial penalty or claim against her work. Daniel's jaw tightened. Natalie's smile faded slightly. Evelyn stood. "Your Honor," she said, calm and controlled, "we submit Exhibit A through Exhibit F, supporting repeated violations of this agreement, as well as separate causes for financial abuse and coercive control." Screens were turned on, videos played, the pharmacy counter, the decline card, the timestamp 3 days after surgery, the hospital room, divorce papers on a tray, Grace holding newborn twins, the nurse's incident report confirming timing and content. Natalie instructing staff to remove baby items from the house while Grace was recovering elsewhere. Margaret directing dirty mop water to be used to humiliate Grace during pregnancy. Gate logs showing Grace's access removed without any court order. Email chains from Daniel and Natalie using company resources, trying to sell Reed Whitmore Analytics to Veridian while describing capabilities lifted from Grace's protected materials. The room went completely still. No whispers. No phones. Just the sound of truth playing out. Natalie's smile cracked. Her hand tightened around the armrest. Daniel stood abruptly. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's mentally unstable. She spent everything." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down," he said firmly. Daniel froze, then slowly sat. Evelyn remained composed. "Your Honor," she said, "we're not asking the prenup to decide everything. We're asking the court to enforce what Daniel Whitmore voluntarily signed and to weigh his conduct, as documented, in determining custody and financial awards." The judge continued reviewing the documents in front of him. "The court finds clear evidence," he said at last, "of financial abuse, coercion in a medical setting, and attempted interference with the protected party's lawful business interests." He looked directly at Daniel. "The prenuptial agreement is valid and fully enforceable." He turned a page. "The divorce is granted." Natalie inhaled sharply. "Restitution is ordered," the judge continued. "All funds improperly transferred to Miss Reed under the guise of consulting fees are to be returned to the marital estate, then allocated according to the prenup. Mr. Whitmore will be responsible for Mrs. Whitmore's legal fees." Daniel's face drained of color. "Regarding custody," the judge went on, "the court is persuaded by the pattern of behavior toward Mrs. Whitmore during pregnancy, birth, and postpartum, including attempts to destabilize her financially while she was recovering from surgery." He looked at Grace now. "Primary physical and legal custody is awarded to Mrs. Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Whitmore will have supervised visitation pending completion of a parenting and counseling program, after which the court may revisit the schedule." Margaret stiffened, lips pressed into a thin line. Natalie stared straight ahead, as if not moving would make the words less real. The judge closed the file. This court will not tolerate abuse disguised as authority, he said. Grace remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't react dramatically. The room buzzed quietly as the weight of the decision settled. Then the judge looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his tone shifting. Counsel has requested an opportunity for you to make a brief statement for the record. You are not obligated to speak. Would you like to? Grace lifted her eyes for the first time. The room leaned in, and somewhere deep in the silence, something irreversible waited to be spoken. The silence shattered the moment Grace stood up. Chairs scraped softly against the floor. Cameras lifted all at once. The room seemed to lean forward, hungry, waiting. Daniel felt it before he understood it. Grace Whitmore stepped away from the table slowly, her movements careful but steady. She stood tall, shoulders relaxed, hands unclenched. There was no anger on her face. No fear, no hesitation. That was what unsettled everyone. She wasn't shaking. She wasn't crying. She wasn't asking for mercy. The judge nodded once, granting permission. Grace turned not toward Daniel, not toward Natalie, not toward Margaret, but toward the press and court observers gathered at the back of the room. Reporters, cameras, recorders, people who would carry this story outside the walls. She took one breath, then she spoke. I was presented with divorce documents while recovering from surgery, Grace said evenly. My children were hours old. The words landed hard. A ripple moved through the room. Pens paused. Fingers tightened around cameras. Grace continued, her voice calm, controlled, impossible to interrupt. My access to the home I lived in was revoked without a court order, she said. My accounts were closed while I was still in a hospital bed. My children's basic needs were turned into leverage. Daniel shifted in his seat. Natalie's posture stiffened. Margaret's jaw tightened. Grace didn't look at them. My silence, Grace said, was mistaken for consent. Cameras clicked rapidly now. Flash after flash lit the room, but Grace didn't flinch. She had lived through worse than bright lights. She paused not because she was overwhelmed, but because she chose to. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. This isn't revenge, Daniel scoffed under his breath. Grace heard it. She turned then, finally, and looked at him. This is accountability, she said. The word echoed. Natalie's remaining composure slipped. Her throat moved as she swallowed hard. She stared down at her hands, nails digging into her palm. Grace shifted her gaze to Margaret. For years, Grace said calmly, I was told to stay quiet, to be grateful, to endure. Margaret didn't blink. But endurance, Grace continued, is not agreement. The room was so quiet now that every breath felt loud. Grace turned back toward the judge and the press. And for the record, she said, her tone still level, still restrained, the company that licensed the algorithm I built quietly, over years finalized a deal the day my children were born. Daniel's head snapped up. Grace didn't stop. Their internal valuation of that technology, she said, exceeds $1 billion. The reaction was immediate. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A reporter whispered, did she say billion? Another dropped a pen. Natalie's face drained of color. Daniel froze. Margaret stared straight ahead, unmoving, as if her body hadn't caught up to the moment yet. Grace didn't elaborate. She didn't explain. She didn't name the company. She didn't need to. Her lawyer, the court, and Viridian's legal team had already confirmed everything off camera. Today's words were not a boast. They were a statement of fact on the public record. Grace stepped back slowly, returning to her seat beside Evelyn. Her hands rested in her lap, calm, still. The room buzzed, now low voices, frantic typing, whispered disbelief. Daniel stared at the table. Natalie's phone buzzed. Once, she ignored it. It buzzed again. And again, Natalie glanced down despite herself. Messages stacked across the screen. We need to pause our collaboration. Given today's ruling, we have to distance. Call will not proceed. Her fingers tightened around the phone. Grace didn't look at her. She didn't need to. The judge called for order, but the energy in the room had shifted permanently. The story no longer belonged to Daniel, or Margaret, or Natalie. It belonged to Grace. And as Natalie's phone continued to vibrate uncontrollably, urgently, one truth became impossible to ignore. What had started as a private betrayal was now a matter of public record. And the collapse had only just begun. The first notification hit Daniel's phone like a slap. Access revoked. He frowned, sitting in the back of a rideshare, still in the same suit he had worn to court that morning. His jaw was tight, his mind replaying Grace's words even as he tried to drown them out. The company that licensed the algorithm I built, internal valuation exceeds $1 billion. He had barely slept the night before. He hadn't expected to lose. Another notification blinked across the screen. Accounts under review. Then another. Mandatory meeting. Compliance and HR. 3 p.m. Daniel's chest tightened. This wasn't supposed to touch him. This was supposed to be messy for Grace, not for him. He was the one with status, contacts, influence. He was the one people respected. He stepped out of the car and headed toward his office building, walking a little too fast, trying to look casual. The lobby felt different, quieter. Eyes followed him, then quickly looked away. He swiped his access card at the turnstile. Red light. He tried again. Red. Must be an error, he muttered. Security approached him, 2 guards he knew by name. Today, they wouldn't meet his eyes. Mr. Whitmore, one said carefully. They asked us to bring you straight to the executive floor. Daniel forced a smile. Of course, he said. They probably need me to help handle the press. They rode the elevator in silence. On the top floor, he walked into the corner office that had always belonged to his mentor, then to him in all but title. The senior executive, a man who once praised Daniel for his bold instincts, sat behind the desk. He didn't stand. Good afternoon, Daniel said, forcing charm into his voice. I assume you've seen the circus. Completely one-sided. I can explain. The executive slid a plain cardboard box across the desk. Your access has been terminated, he said flatly. Effective immediately. Daniel blinked. Excuse me? Compliance reviewed the testimony and court documents, the man said. The financial abuse. The attempt to funnel funds as consulting payments. The emails to Viridian, using our company's signature, to promote Reed Whitmore Analytics. That's my private life, Daniel snapped. You can't. You attached our logo to it, the man cut in. You represented yourself as acting with our backing while trying to profit from a technology you had no rights to. That makes it our problem. On the wall outside, where Daniel's name had once been listed under future partners, there was now an empty space. His nameplate was already gone. He stared at the box, personal items, framed photos, awards he had proudly displayed. Security will escort you out, the man said. You're not to contact any clients. Legal will follow up regarding potential claims. Daniel laughed once, bitter and small. You're throwing me out over her? He demanded. Over a woman who spent her life doing nothing? The executive's face hardened. You might want to read the business news before you describe her that way, he said. It seems the market disagrees. Daniel didn't answer. He picked up the box. His hands felt heavier than the weight inside it. Security led him through the office he used to walk through like he owned it. Today, no one greeted him. No one met his eyes. Conversations died as he passed. In the reflection of the elevator doors, he didn't see a powerful man. He saw someone who had bet everything on control and never bothered to read the fine print. Across town, Natalie Reed sat alone in her car, parked in a quiet lot. Her hands shook as she scrolled. Headline after headline flashed across her screen. Court confirms abuse. Upholds prenup in Whitmore case. Consultant named in misuse of funds allegations. Shell company linked to attempted IP interference under review. She opened her banking app. AC count temporarily restricted pending review. Her laugh came out sharp and brittle. This wasn't the plan, she whispered. Natalie had always been strategic. She didn't fall into affairs. She leveraged them. She didn't attach herself to men for romance. She attached herself for access. Daniel was supposed to be a step up, not an anchor. Her phone buzzed again, messages from numbers she recognized. Given today's ruling, we have to pause our work together. Our firm can't be associated with ongoing investigations. We wish you the best moving forward. She knew what those words meant. They were done with her. Natalie dialed Daniel's number. Straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. Anger rose, hot and fast. She started the engine and drove. That night, the house looked different. Not physically the same walls, the same furniture, but the energy was gone. The arrogance was gone. The illusion was gone. Daniel stood in the bedroom, tie discarded on the floor, cardboard box on the bed. He pulled open drawers with more force than necessary. You said this wouldn't touch me, he said, his voice rough. You said we could spin it. Natalie stood near the dresser, suitcase open, clothes thrown in without care. She didn't look at him. I said we could manage it if you kept her calm, Natalie replied coolly. You dragged her into a legal war while she was in a hospital bed. That's not spin, that's evidence. Daniel slammed the drawer shut. You push this, he growled. You told me to make a statement, to show her she had nothing without me. Natalie turned slowly, eyes cold, no sympathy left. I told you to win, she said. You chose cruelty. There's a difference. Daniel stared at her. You're leaving? He demanded. Now? Natalie didn't flinch. I don't stay where there's no future, she said simply. She picked up the last item from the dresser, a watch he had given her, bought with money that now tied directly to court-ordered restitution. She slid it onto her wrist anyway. This place was never really yours, she added. You only thought it was. She closed the suitcase and pulled up the handle. Daniel took a step toward her. You don't walk away from me, he said. Not after everything. She stopped in the doorway and looked back one last time. Watch me, she said. Then she left. Not crying, not apologizing, not loyal, just gone. The door clicked shut behind her. The sound echoed through the empty house. Daniel sat down on the edge of the bed. The quiet pressed in on him, heavier than any noise. No footsteps, no voices. No phone calls demanding his time. His phone vibrated once on the nightstand. He grabbed it. A news alert lit the screen. Grace Whitmore secures full custody. $1 billion licensing deal. Confirms her IP dominance. Below it, another suggested article. How a quiet strategist outmaneuvered everyone inside the Whitmore prenup. Daniel stared at the words until they blurred. For the first time, the truth truly landed. He hadn't lost Grace because she was nothing. He had lost everything because he never cared to see what she was building on paper, in silence, right beside him. He dropped the phone onto the bed and buried his face in his hands. In another part of the city, Grace was signing documents in a sunlit room, closing doors he didn't even know existed. And while Daniel sat in a house stripped of voices, allies, and purpose, one quiet reality waited just ahead. Her ending would not look like his at all. The knock came sharp and sudden. Grace Whitmore flinched not from fear but from habit. For weeks, every unexpected sound had carried weight. Lawyers, documents, court dates, consequences. Now finally, it was about something else. She steadied herself, then crossed the room. Sunlight poured through the tall window, warming the quiet space. The twins slept in their bassinets near the couch, wrapped snugly, their breathing slow and even. The room smelled faintly of clean linen and baby lotion. Grace opened the door. Evelyn Ross stood there, a slim folder tucked under her arm. It's finished, Evelyn said simply. The words hit with the same force as a shout. Grace stepped aside to let her in. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Evelyn placed the folder on the table and opened it carefully, as if even now, the paper deserved respect. She turned the last page toward Grace. Final judgment, Evelyn said. The time to appeal has passed. All orders stand. Custody, restitution, enforcement of the prenup. The court's done. There's nothing left for him to challenge. Grace stared at the signature line. Her name was already there, printed neatly. All that remained was one last acknowledgement at the bottom. She picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. As she signed, the weight she'd been carrying for years loosened at once quietly, without drama. No rush of triumph, no tears, just release. Evelyn closed the folder. It's over, she said. Grace nodded. Evelyn lingered for a moment, then glanced at the twins. They'll never remember any of this, she said softly. Grace followed her gaze. No, Grace replied. But they'll grow up knowing what I did with it. Evelyn smiled, just briefly, then gathered her things. Viridian's rollout starts next quarter, she added. They'll handle the publicity on their side. You don't have to do anything you don't want to. Your ownership is secure with or without interviews. Grace's shoulders relaxed. I don't need billboards, she said. I just need stability. You have it, Evelyn replied. Call me for the fun contracts next time, not the survival ones. Grace walked her to the door. When it closed, the silence returned. But this silence was different. It didn't press in. It didn't accuse. It didn't demand endurance. It simply existed. Grace crossed the room and sat between the bassinets, resting her hands lightly on the edge of each one. The twins stirred, then settled again. She watched them for a long time. Her mind drifted not backward to what she had lost, but forward to what had been preserved. Her dignity, her work, her children's safety. No one could rewrite that now. Grace stood and walked to the window. Outside, the day moved on without spectacle. Cars passed. Trees shifted in the breeze. Somewhere people hurried through lives that had nothing to do with hers anymore. She didn't feel anger. She didn't feel victory. She felt calm. And calm, she realized, was the rarest kind of freedom. Grace leaned her forehead lightly against the glass and whispered, so softly that only the room could hear her, "We're free." Behind her, the twins slept on. The camera lingered not on wealth, not on headlines, not on consequences, but on stillness. On a woman who had been erased and refused to disappear. On a future built quietly, deliberately, and entirely on her own terms. And somewhere far away, the noise of Daniel's collapse continued without her. She didn't need to watch it. She had already moved on. Because the strongest ending isn't revenge, it's peace. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share, and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video. Unaware her father was a secret trillionaire who bought his company. Husband and mistress call his wife uneducated at her mother's grave until he met his new boss. He didn't just insult her, he did it standing over her mother's grave. The grass was still damp when Ethan Cole folded his arms, looked down at the wife who had followed him through every struggle, and said, loud enough for the other woman and his mother to hear, "You're uneducated, Grace. Just like her. She was nothing. And so are you." Beside him, Lydia Blake, the confident, polished woman from his office, bit back a smile and added softly, "This is where uneducated women end up." Lydia added softly, raising more of themselves. Margaret Cole, his mother, didn't stop them. She just stared at the grave and said coldly, "You can't give what you never had." The cemetery fell silent. No one defended Grace. No one said, "Enough." Kneeling on the cold ground, Grace Reed kept her hands low so they wouldn't see them shake. Her dress was simple, her jewelry modest, her life quiet. To them, she was just the soft-spoken wife from a small background, the woman who didn't understand business, the one they could insult because she had no education, no place, no power. What none of them knew was this: the woman they were calling uneducated was the daughter of Henry Reed, a man who had spent years hiding his true identity. On paper, he was just a retired widower. In the right documents, under the right holding companies, among people who actually understood capital, he was one of those near mythic men people joked about in finance. The kind whose scattered assets and quiet control made him feel like a trillionaire, even if no magazine could ever print the full picture. While Ethan bragged about his job and worshipped the company he worked for, Grace's father was quietly buying controlling interest in that very same company, the one Ethan thought would finally prove he was better than the wife he was trying to erase. The day Ethan chose to humiliate Grace at her mother's grave, he had no idea his entire career was already resting on assets her family secretly controlled. This isn't just a story about a cruel sentence at a graveside. It's about what happens when a man and his mistress laugh at a woman they believe is beneath them while answering to a new boss they never saw coming. Dear viewers, thank you for being here. If you watch without subscribing, it's like letting Grace be mocked in silence the way they mocked her at that grave. When you click that button, you stand with every quiet, underestimated woman who refused to stay small. Please, subscribe now and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. The first insult didn't come in anger, it came casually, which made it worse. "You really don't get how the world works, Grace," Ethan said, adjusting his tie in the mirror. "Just don't talk too much when we're out. It makes you look slow." Grace Reed stood behind him, holding his jacket the way she always did. Her fingers tightened for half a second, then relaxed. She was 30 years old, calm, soft-spoken, and already learning that love, when mixed with pride, could turn sharp without warning. She said nothing. She always said nothing. That silence had been taught to her long before Ethan ever entered her life. Grace grew up believing wealth was loud and dignity was quiet. Her father, Henry Reed, was 58 now, a reserved man with tired eyes and a gentle voice. To the outside world, he was nothing special. A widower who wore plain jackets, drove an older sedan, and lived modestly. People assumed he had retired early from some mid-level job and lived carefully off savings. That assumption was intentional. Grace's mother had died when Grace was 11. A sudden illness. No drama, no long goodbye. Just an empty side of the bed and a house that felt too quiet overnight. Henry never remarried. Instead, he raised Grace alone, packed her lunches, attended school meetings, sat through recitals even when she forgot her lines. He never spoke badly about the world, but he taught her how to move through it carefully. After her mother's death, Grace once asked him why they didn't live like other families, why they didn't move to a bigger house, why they didn't travel, even though he clearly could afford a little more than they had. Henry had smiled gently and said a sentence Grace would carry into adulthood. If people know what you have, they'll stop seeing who you are. At the time, she thought he meant emotions. She didn't know he meant everything else too. There were signs, of course. Looking back, the clues were everywhere. Henry always paid cash, never cards, never loans, never debt. He kept documents in fireproof cases, organized by year, not emotion. Sometimes late at night, Grace would hear him on the phone, his voice suddenly sharp, precise, using words she didn't understand. Percentages, acquisitions, boards. Then the call would end, and Henry would return to the kitchen, smiling, asking if she wanted tea. When Grace questioned him once, really questioned him, he gave her one rule. Never tell anyone who you really are, he said calmly. Let them reveal themselves first. That rule shaped her entire life. Grace studied quietly, worked without drawing attention. She inherited something far more valuable than money restraint. When she turned 25, Henry transferred something into her name without ceremony. A small holding company, old family assets, all clean, legal, boring to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. This is yours, he said. Not to spend, to understand, learn to read what's behind numbers, not just the numbers themselves. Grace never told anyone, not even her husband. She met Ethan Cole when she was 27. He was ambitious, charming, insecure in a way that demanded constant validation. He talked about success like it was oxygen, something he needed to survive. Grace admired his drive, believed in his dreams. She didn't realize she was slowly shrinking to make room for them. By the time they married, Ethan had already begun correcting her in public. You wouldn't understand corporate pressure, he said once at dinner with friends, laughing. Grace's world is simpler, he joked another time. And now, standing in front of the mirror, he had stopped pretending it was a joke at all. Just don't embarrass me, he said, taking the jacket from her hands without thanks. Grace nodded. Inside, something shifted, not breaking yet, but bending. Later that night, Grace sat alone in the bedroom while Ethan scrolled on his phone, smiling at messages he claimed were work-related. She noticed the way he angled the screen away from her, the way his tone changed when he spoke about image and upgrade and who fits where. He didn't know she noticed. He also didn't know that she'd been trained her entire life to observe quietly. Grace looked at the framed photo on the nightstand, her mother's smile frozen in time. A reminder of softness, of loss, of the strength required to endure without applause. She thought of her father, Henry, sitting alone in his modest house, reading financial reports no one knew he controlled, occasionally asking her harmless questions like, "How's Ethan's company doing? Do you like the way they treat their people?" And she wondered, not for the first time, why she had married a man who measured worth by appearances, when she had been raised by someone who hid power like a secret weapon. The question lingered in the room, unanswered. Grace didn't know it yet, but the world she had carefully kept separate, love, money, dignity, truth, was already beginning to collide. And soon, very soon, the people who mistook her silence for weakness would discover just how dangerous patience could be. She smoothed the blanket, turned off the light, and chose once again not to speak. Quiet had always been her armor, but armor, when tested long enough, eventually becomes a blade, and the man sleeping beside her was about to give her a reason to use it. "You're holding me back." The words hit Grace before she had time to sit down. Ethan stood in the living room, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp with irritation. He paced as if the space belonged only to him now. Grace froze near the doorway, a stack of printed reports in her hands, reports she had stayed up all night correcting for him. "I said I'd handle it," Ethan snapped into the phone. "No, she doesn't get how this works. Just trust me." He ended the call and finally turned to her. "What?" he asked, already annoyed. "What are you standing there for?" Grace swallowed. "I finished fixing the slides. The numbers on page 12 were off. The projections didn't match the last quarter." Ethan took the papers without looking at her. "You wouldn't understand corporate pressure, Grace," he said casually. "This isn't your world." It wasn't the insult that hurt. It was how easily it came out of him. Grace smiled anyway. She always did. She had met Ethan Cole 3 years earlier, when he was still chasing his first real promotion. Back then, his ambition had felt exciting, almost hopeful. He talked about success the way some people talked about family, like something he was meant to have, even if he didn't know how to reach it yet. Others doubted him. Grace didn't. She believed in him when his ideas were raw, and his confidence was fragile. She sat beside him on late nights, listening to practice speeches, gently correcting his grammar, helping him sound more polished. When he stumbled, she didn't point it out in public. She fixed it quietly, in private. She thought that was love. She didn't notice how often her support became invisible. Ethan's mother, Margaret Cole, noticed everything. Margaret was a woman who believed authority was inherited, not earned. She spoke softly, but her words always landed where they could do the most damage. From the moment Grace entered the family, Margaret measured her not by kindness, but by usefulness. During one family dinner, Grace made the mistake of explaining a financial article she'd read. She spoke calmly, clearly, her confidence natural and unforced. Margaret's smile tightened. She didn't interrupt Grace, she waited. Later, when Grace went to refill drinks, Margaret leaned toward her son and whispered just loud enough to be heard. "She makes you look smaller when she talks like that," Margaret said. "You're the one who's supposed to shine." "She should be softer," Ethan laughed. Uncertain at first, then louder. Grace returned to the table and felt the shift immediately. The air was colder. The conversation moved on without her. That night, Ethan repeated the thought as if it were his own. "My mom thinks you try too hard to sound smart," he said, lying in bed, scrolling through his phone. "Maybe you should just relax and let me handle things in public. It's better for my image." Grace stared at the ceiling. She didn't argue. Her loyalty showed up in 100 small sacrifices. She delayed her own plans so Ethan could chase his. She declined invitations so he wouldn't feel distracted. She learned when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Whenever Grace did speak confidently, Margaret reacted the same way. A brief flinch, then a controlled smile. As if she had almost revealed something dangerous. Grace noticed it, but she didn't understand it yet. What she didn't see was how those moments were being collected, examined, reframed, and quietly used against her. Ethan's promotions came faster after that. With every step upward, his patience for Grace thinned. He started using phrases she recognized, phrases that weren't originally his. "Don't overthink it. You're too emotional. Just let me handle it." Once, after Grace gently suggested a different approach to a work problem, Ethan snapped. "Stop talking like you know what pressure feels like," he said. "You stay home most of the time. You wouldn't last a week where I am." The room went silent. Grace nodded. Apologized for something she hadn't done. Inside, a quiet question formed, then disappeared. She thought of her father, then Henry's calm presence, his steady hands, the way he never raised his voice even when others tried to provoke him. She remembered his rule, let people reveal themselves. So she watched. She noticed how Ethan's tone changed around certain people. How he straightened when talking about status. How his frustration always flowed downward, never up. And she noticed something else too. Ethan no longer thanked her. The help she gave was expected now, like furniture, useful but replaceable. One evening, after another late night of revisions, Grace handed Ethan a polished report. He skimmed it quickly and smiled not at her, but at the phone lighting up in his hand. "Good," he said. "This should impress the right people." Grace waited. "Anything else?" he asked. "No," she said softly. As she walked away, Margaret's earlier sentiment echoed in her mind, the idea that Grace had nothing of her own. Grace had everything of her own. She had just been taught never to show it, and that more than any insult would become their greatest mistake. In the next moment, Ethan's phone buzzed again. He turned away to answer it, unaware that someone new was about to step into their lives, someone who would twist his hunger for status into something far more dangerous. Grace knew something was wrong the moment she walked into the room. The laughter was louder than it needed to be. Too sharp, too rehearsed. Conversations paused for half a second when she entered, then resumed with forced brightness. Grace felt it in her chest before she understood it with her mind, the feeling of walking into a space that had already decided she did not belong. The company dinner was meant to celebrate Ethan's recent promotion and the new project his team had landed. A long table, soft lighting, colleagues dressed to impress. Spouses and partners were invited, which is why Margaret Cole felt justified in coming as well, to support her son. Grace had chosen a simple dress, neat and understated, the way she always did. She reached for the chair beside her husband, and someone else was already sitting there. The woman looked up slowly, her smile confident and unapologetic. She was in her early 30s, polished, sharp, dressed in a way that demanded attention without asking for permission. Her posture claimed space before her words ever did. "Oh," the woman said lightly, glancing at Grace as if noticing her for the first time. "I thought this seat was open. Ethan said he wasn't sure you'd make it on time." Grace paused. She looked at Ethan. He didn't move, didn't speak, didn't correct anything. That silence was louder than any insult. The woman stood just enough to extend a manicured hand toward Ethan first, then to Grace. "Lydia Blake," she said. "I work closely with the executive team. Ethan and I have been collaborating a lot lately." Her eyes flicked to Grace, assessing, weighing, then back to Ethan. Grace nodded politely. Grace, his wife. Lydia's smile didn't change, but something cool passed behind her eyes, like she had just confirmed a detail in a file. Margaret Cole, seated a few places down, observed the exchange with interest, not concern. Her lips curved slightly upward, approval disguised as calm. "Please," Margaret said smoothly to Lydia. "Stay where you are. Grace can sit anywhere." It wasn't an invitation, it was a dismissal. Grace took a seat across the table instead, folding her hands in her lap. She felt the subtle shift immediately, like furniture being rearranged without asking. As the dinner progressed, Lydia became the center of attention effortlessly. She laughed at the right moments, complimented the right people, touched Ethan's arm just enough to seem familiar without crossing an obvious line in public. Every movement felt practiced, like someone who understood rooms and how to dominate them. Grace noticed something else too. Before every sharp comment, every subtle jab, Lydia glanced at Ethan, always first, as if checking how far she was allowed to go. The conversation turned to career paths. "I've always believed education should be strategic," Lydia said, swirling her glass. "You study what advances you, not just what feels comfortable." Her eyes slid toward Grace. "For success," Lydia continued with a soft laugh, "you need to know the system. It's not something you just pick up reading random articles at home, right?" The table went quiet. Grace felt the words land not just on her, but around her. People shifted. Someone coughed. No one spoke. Ethan smiled faintly and looked down at his drink. Margaret's head dipped in subtle approval. Grace felt her face warm, but she kept her voice steady. "I think learning never stops," she said simply. "It just looks different for everyone." Lydia tilted her head, amused. "How sweet," she replied. "That's one way to look at it." The word sweet didn't mean what it sounded like. Grace excused herself to the restroom a few minutes later. She stood at the sink, hands braced against the counter, breathing slowly. She wasn't angry yet. She was alert. She remembered her father's voice, "Let them reveal themselves first," and Lydia was revealing a great deal. When Grace returned, she noticed Lydia had leaned closer to Ethan. Their shoulders almost touched. Their conversation had dropped into a private register. Margaret watched them like a chessboard, her eyes bright with satisfaction. Grace sat quietly and listened to the gaps, the stretches of silence where her name never came up at all. Later, as dessert was served, Lydia stood to make a light-hearted toast. "To growth," she said. "To ambition, and to knowing when to step aside so others can shine." Her gaze rested on Grace for just a beat too long. Ethan raised his glass. Grace didn't. She looked at her husband instead, really looked at him, at the man who had once needed her belief to survive, who now didn't even seem to notice she was being moved out of his life in front of him, or worse, noticed and allowed it. On the drive home, Ethan was unusually quiet. Grace broke the silence gently. "Who is Lydia really?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's important," he said, "and she has influence with people above me. You should be careful how you come across around people like her." They notice everything. People like her. Grace nodded once. She had learned long ago that questions asked too early were dismissed. Answers arrived only when patience forced them out. She looked out the window, the city lights blurring together. Something had changed tonight. She felt it deeply, the shift from discomfort to danger. Lydia wasn't just a colleague, she was a test, and Ethan had already failed it. As the car pulled into their driveway, Grace's phone buzzed softly in her bag, a notification she didn't check yet, from the banking app she kept an eye on out of habit. She stepped inside the house, her expression calm, her movements measured. Quietly, almost to herself, she thought, this isn't about ambition anymore. This is about replacement. And somewhere behind her, unseen but already moving, the next stage of cruelty was beginning to take shape. Remove that chair. The command cut through the room like a blade. Grace froze mid-step, her hand still hovering near the back of the seat she had always taken at family gatherings. Voices fell quiet, plates stopped clinking. Every eye turned toward Margaret Cole, Ethan's mother, seated at the head of the table like a judge who had already reached a verdict. "We'll put Lydia there," Margaret said calmly to the house staff. "She needs to sit beside my son. They have important things to discuss about his future." For a split second, no one moved. Then Lydia Blake smiled, slow, deliberate, and slid into the chair without hesitation, once it was placed closer to Ethan. She smoothed her dress, glanced up at him, and gave him a look that asked one question only. "Are you going to stop this?" Ethan didn't. He didn't even look at Grace. "Don't make a scene," he muttered, low enough to sound private, loud enough to hurt. "There are guests here." The humiliation wasn't loud, it was surgical. Grace was 30 years old, a wife, a grown woman, and in that moment, she was being pushed to the edges of her own family's table. She stepped back, positioning herself near the sideboard where the staff stood, hands folded neatly in front of her. There were still seats available further down the table, but Margaret's eyes followed her like a warning. Know your place. Grace felt the heat in her face, but she kept her posture steady. Across the table, Ethan's siblings watched in silence. Daniel Cole, the older brother, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Rachel Cole, the younger sister, glanced at Grace once, then quickly looked away, choosing comfort over courage. Friends of the family followed their lead. No one objected. No one spoke up. No one pulled a chair back for her. Silence became a group decision. Margaret lifted her glass. "Now," she said lightly, "let's eat." Dinner continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Lydia laughed easily, telling stories about work, about influence, about being seen by executives. She referred to Ethan's achievements as their progress, her hand brushing his sleeve often enough to claim familiarity. Grace listened. She noticed how Lydia enjoyed the pauses, the moments when her words landed and everyone waited to see who would respond. She noticed how Margaret watched Lydia with approval, as if she had finally found someone who understood the rules of control. When Grace shifted her weight, Lydia glanced over. "Oh," Lydia said sweetly. "You look tired, Grace. You should sit down somewhere. These long dinners can be a lot when you're not used to this kind of environment." A few people laughed quietly, nervously. Grace smiled once, politely. She remembered her father's lesson. Let them reveal themselves. And they were doing it beautifully. Later that evening, Grace stepped outside briefly, needing air. The night was cool. Her hands trembled just slightly as she reached for her phone. A notification caught her eye. Insufficient funds. Transaction declined. She frowned. That didn't make sense. Grace rarely used the joint account, but she knew the balance. She checked it every week, quietly, out of the habit Henry had instilled in her. It had been more than enough a few days ago. She tried again with a smaller test payment. Declined. Inside, Lydia's laughter carried through the open door. Grace took a slow breath and returned to the table. On the drive home, Ethan was silent again, the same silence that had become his shield. They stopped at a small store to pick up groceries before going home. Grace loaded a few basics into the basket, nothing extravagant, just what they needed. At the register, she handed over her card. The machine beeped. Declined. The cashier looked apologetic. People behind them shifted impatiently. Grace felt her chest tighten. Before she could speak, Lydia, who had insisted on riding with them under the excuse of catching up on tomorrow's plans, leaned in close, her voice low and precise. Joint accounts can be tricky, she murmured, lips barely moving. Especially when one person brings in all the real money. Ethan said nothing. He pretended to scroll his phone. Grace completed the purchase with cash she kept hidden in her bag, a habit her father had taught her without ever fully explaining why she might need it. As they walked out, she glanced at Ethan's screen for a second. Lydia Blake, pin chat, new messages, constant. That night, while Ethan showered, Grace sat alone at the kitchen table. She opened the banking app again, this time slowly, carefully. Transfers she didn't recognize. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. All authorized by Ethan, all to the same external account. The account holder's name was partially redacted, but the initials were enough. L. B. Grace didn't panic. She documented everything. Dates, times, amounts, screenshots. She remembered her father's words, write it down. From the hallway, she heard Ethan's voice drop into a tone she didn't recognize anymore. Yes, he said quietly on the phone. It's handled. She doesn't check things. Don't worry. Grace closed the app. She looked around the house, the walls she had decorated, the space she had made safe, now slowly turning hostile. Something fundamental had shifted. This wasn't carelessness anymore. It was intention. Before bed, Grace caught her reflection in the mirror. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way the world around her was trying to shrink her. She straightened her shoulders. She thought of her mother. Of the way she had been dismissed quietly, remembered softly, underestimated always. And she felt something settle inside her, not rage, but resolve. Grace didn't know yet where this cruelty would lead, but she sensed it was moving towards something sacred, something final. As she turned off the light, her phone buzzed again, a message preview from an unfamiliar number she didn't open yet. She placed the phone face down. And somewhere, in a place meant for silence and respect, words were already being sharpened for her next humiliation. Why are we even here? Ethan's voice shattered the silence before Grace could kneel. The graveyard was quiet, wide, and open, the kind of place where sound carried farther than intended. The visit had been squeezed between Ethan's important meeting and a brunch he'd promised to attend with Lydia and a few colleagues. He'd insisted they all come in one car to save time. Grace stood still for a moment, fingers tightening around the small bouquet she had bought herself. No one else had thought to bring flowers. She was 30 years old, standing at her mother's grave, with her husband, his mother, and his colleague behind her, and already, she felt exposed. This matters to me, Grace said softly. It's the anniversary. Ethan sighed, the sound heavy with irritation. You're being dramatic again. We don't have all day. Grace ignored him and lowered herself to her knees. The grass was damp, soaking through the fabric of her dress. She placed the flowers carefully, her movements slow, respectful. This was the one place she allowed herself to be vulnerable. Her mother's name was carved into stone, simple, clean, honest. Grace bowed her head. For a moment there was peace. Then Lydia laughed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obviously cruel at first. It was the kind of short, surprised laugh people made when they saw something they didn't value. So this is where you grew up visiting? Lydia Blake said, stepping closer in her sharp heels. It's quiet. Her eyes moved over the grave, then over Grace's bowed form. I always say, Lydia added lightly, when women don't get real education or guidance, they just repeat the same small life, same choices, same limits, raising more uneducated versions of themselves. The words hung in the air. Grace's shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. Behind Lydia, Margaret Cole stood with her hands folded, her expression unreadable. She did not intervene. She never did. Ethan gave a short, mirthless chuckle. She never studied anything useful, Ethan said, shaking his head. You know that, right? Completely unprepared for the real world. Just emotional. Just there. Grace's breath caught. Ethan took a step closer to the headstone, as if he had some right to stand there. She was nothing, Grace, he continued, his voice firmer now, almost impatient. Your mom spent her life in this little circle, and you're repeating it. You're uneducated. This is why you'll never understand how the world works. The word uneducated landed again heavier this time, because it came from the man who had once claimed to love her. Inside Grace's coat pocket, her phone was already recording. She had turned it on quietly in the car, out of the same habit that had made her screenshot the bank transfers. She hadn't planned his exact words, but she knew the pattern. now knew that when he was with his mother and Lydia, his cruelty got bolder. She didn't announce it. She didn't confront them. She didn't argue. She listened. She documented. She remembered her father's voice, clear as if he were standing beside her. When they show you who they are, believe them. Then write it down. Grace slowly raised her head. She looked at the stone, at her mother's name, at the woman who had worked quietly, sacrificed endlessly, and never once demanded recognition. Margaret finally spoke. "You can't give what you never had," she said calmly. "That's just reality. Some women just don't have the capacity." Grace stood up. Her knees were shaking, but her hands were steady. Lydia stepped closer again, emboldened by Ethan's approval. "Honestly," she said, lowering her voice, "not everyone is meant to be in certain circles. You should be grateful Ethan's kept you comfortable this long." Grace met her eyes. Lydia faltered for just a second, not because Grace looked angry, but because she didn't look broken. She looked observant. Margaret cleared her throat. "Let's go. We're going to be late. There's nothing more to do here." "Nothing more." Grace glanced back at the grave. She bent down once more, brushing dirt from the stone with care. This time, she spoke not to them, but to herself. "I see you," she whispered. Then she stood, turned and walked past them without another word. Ethan scoffed. "See? Overreacting again." Grace didn't respond. She didn't need to. On the drive back, no one spoke. Lydia checked her reflection in the mirror, satisfied. Margaret stared out the window, already rewriting the story in her head. Grace was unstable, emotional, ungrateful. Ethan scrolled through his phone, checking messages about work and ignoring the way his wife sat, pressed against the car door. Grace sat silently in the back seat. Her phone buzzed once, a notification that the recording had been saved and backed up to the cloud automatically. She didn't check it yet. She knew what was on it. Insults. Admissions. Contempt spoken freely. Truth. Grace closed her eyes and took a slow breath. This wasn't the end of her patience, it was the end of her doubt. She had spent years wondering if she was too quiet, too soft, too invisible. Standing at her mother's grave, listening to the people closest to her strip her of dignity, Grace finally understood something clearly. They weren't powerful. They were careless. And careless people always left evidence behind. As the car turned onto the road, Grace felt something shift, not inside her, but around her. Like the sense that she was no longer alone in this. That somewhere, unseen, someone had already noticed what happened at the grave. And that her silence, the kind she had mastered her entire life, was about to become very, very loud. Grace stopped reacting. That was the first thing they noticed. No tears, no arguments, no questions. After the graveyard, she moved through the house like a ghost, calm, polite, distant. She still cooked, still cleaned, still answered when spoken to. But the warmth was gone. Ethan mistook it for surrender. Lydia mistook it for fear. Margaret mistook it for defeat. They were wrong. Grace Reed had simply gone quiet in the way her father taught her to go quiet, the way people did when they were preparing. She did not confront Ethan about the insults at the grave. She did not ask why her card had been declined. She did not mention the word uneducated again. Instead, she began separating herself, emotionally first, then practically. She opened a small notebook she had kept hidden in the back of a drawer, blank until now. On the first page, she wrote the date of the graveyard visit. Under it, one word: evidence. Grace remembered her father's voice clearly, steady and unafraid. Never mix survival money with shared accounts. Years ago, Henry Reed had quietly helped her set aside a small emergency fund in her own name. Nothing dramatic, nothing flashy, just enough to move if the ground ever gave way. That was the money she used now. 2 days later, Grace sat in a discreet office above a pharmacy, the kind of place you only found if you'd been told where to look. Across from her sat Caleb Morris, an independent investigator in his early 40s. No dramatic trench coat, no movie-style theatrics. Just a laptop, a notepad, and the tired eyes of a man who had seen more than people thought he had. "My job," he said plainly, "is to confirm what already feels wrong." Grace nodded. "I'm not looking for revenge," she said. "I need facts. I need to know I'm not imagining this." Caleb nodded once. "Then we start with what you can legally give me access to." She signed authorizations for bank statements, for her own phone records, for any accounts where her name appeared. She slid her screenshots across the desk. Transfers, balance changes, card declines. Caleb studied them in silence. Good, he said quietly. You've already done half my work. The first records came back within days. Joint account withdrawals, small amounts at first, then larger ones. All traced to one destination and account linked to Lydia Blake. He didn't take everything at once, Caleb explained, tapping the statements. He staggered it. That's what people do when they don't want questions yet. Grace wrote it down. Dates, amounts, patterns. She wasn't shocked. She was relieved. Proof meant she wasn't crazy. Next came emails. Through a formal request and with Grace's written complaint, Caleb connected with someone inside the company's compliance department, a woman named Elena Shaw. Elena, small and sharp-eyed, joined them one afternoon, setting her company laptop on the table like a witness. Internally, Elena said, "This is how you've been described." She turned the screen toward Grace. "She's emotionally unstable. She's distracting him from performance. I'm concerned she may become a liability to his focus." All from Lydia. All sent shortly before or after events Grace remembered clearly. Grace recognized the language immediately. Professional, polite, poisonous. She was building a record, Caleb said, in case she ever needed to justify getting rid of you. Grace closed her eyes briefly. She remembered Margaret's approving nods, the timing of Lydia's smiles, the way Ethan had started repeating phrases that weren't his. This wasn't impulsive. It was coordinated. A week later, Elena arrived with something heavier. Security footage, time-stamped, clear. The video showed Lydia late one evening in the office alone. She stood near a metal bin, holding an envelope. The camera caught the details. Grace's name was on it. The return address, a respected law firm. Elena paused the video. "This letter was sent to your husband's office address," she explained. "It should have been forwarded to you. Instead, it ended up with her." They watched as Lydia opened the envelope, scanned the contents, then struck a match and dropped the papers into the bin. Flames rose, ate the pages, died down. Lydia watched, expression flat. Caleb glanced at Grace. "We traced what was burned. The firm keeps digital copies." He slid a printed document toward her. It was from a law office representing a holding company. Not just any holding company, her holding company, the one Henry had placed in her name at 25. The letter informed her that, through that entity, she now held a small but real block of shares in the very company Ethan worked for and invited her to register directly as a beneficial shareholder. "The timing lines up with when your father increased his position," Caleb added. "Once his holdings crossed a certain threshold, they were required to list you formally as part of that structure." "If you'd seen this," Caleb said, "you'd know you weren't just a spouse. You were a stakeholder." Grace's fingers tightened on the page. "So she destroyed it," Grace said quietly, "to make sure I stayed small." She didn't cry. She asked one question. "Is the footage clear enough to identify her?" "Very," Elena replied. Grace added another page to the notebook. Document destruction, legal mail. Motive, hide shareholder status. The final piece, for now, came from Elena. Internal HR files. Complaints Lydia had filed about Grace's interference, all submitted within minutes or hours of private exchanges between Lydia and Margaret at social events. "The timestamps matter," Elena said. "It shows intent. This isn't about you losing your temper. This is about them constructing a version of you." Grace understood that better than anyone. At home, Ethan grew restless. "You've been quiet," he said one night, watching her carefully. "What are you thinking about?" Grace smiled faintly. "Just listening." Lydia texted more often. Margaret called more often. They could feel something shifting, even if they didn't know what. Silence unsettled them. Grace kept documenting, backing up, organizing. She wasn't angry anymore. She was ready. That night, as she closed the notebook, her phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. "Mrs. Cole, my name is Michael Grant. I'm the acting CEO at the company where your husband works. I've seen some of what you've gathered. We should talk." Grace stared at the screen. She didn't reply. Not yet. Because evidence, she knew, only mattered if someone powerful was willing to act. And somewhere above her husband's pay grade, power was already moving. The decision was made long before the graveyard. Months before Grace pressed record in her coat pocket, Henry Reed was sitting alone in a quiet conference room, his hands folded neatly on the table. At 60, he carried himself with the calm of a man who had seen markets rise and fall and egos grow and collapse. On the surface, he looked ordinary. Plain suit, no watch that screamed status, no entourage. But the documents in front of him told a different story. They told the story of ownership. On paper, Henry was a retired widower. In reality, he was the controlling force behind a network of holding companies and funds that quietly moved through industries like a shadow. He had built his entire life around one principle. If they don't know what you own, they'll show you who they are. He applied that principle to his money. And without ever saying it out loud, to the people around his daughter. Henry had never interfered in Grace's marriage. She visited on weekends, called often. She talked about Ethan's ambition, his long hours, his networking. She never complained, she always defended, but Henry listened to what she didn't say. Her pauses lasted longer. Her laugh sometimes sounded forced. Her eyes drifted when he asked, "Do you feel safe? Do you feel respected?" She always answered, "I'm fine." Henry believed her. He did not believe Ethan. When he first looked into the company Ethan worked for, he hadn't planned to do anything more than understand where his son-in-law spent his time. The company was not small, mid-size, profitable, proud of its growth. Its shares were spread across funds, trusts, and individual investors who believed themselves informed. Henry understood systems like this better than anyone. Through layered holdings, legal, quiet, precise, he began acquiring shares. Not all at once, not in ways that triggered alarms, slowly, methodically. Within weeks, he held effective controlling interest. No one noticed. No one ever did, until he wanted them to. The first board meeting he attended as a majority stakeholder was uneventful on the surface. Board members arrived expecting another routine discussion, forecasts, projections, a few questions about culture they didn't intend to answer honestly. Instead, they were introduced to him. "This is Henry Reed," the acting CEO announced. "He now represents the controlling interest in our organization." Murmurs followed. Henry stood, nodded once, and sat back down. "I'm not here to interfere with your day-to-day," he said evenly. "I'm here to understand what kind of place my money is supporting." One of the board members cleared his throat. "Understand in what sense?" Henry met his gaze without blinking. "In the sense of culture," he said. "Patterns, behavior, who gets silenced, who gets protected." No one argued. They just adjusted their ties and hoped they weren't the problem. After the meeting, the acting CEO, Michael Grant, a seasoned leader, brought in specifically for transitions like this, followed Henry into a smaller office. "Most people in your position want changes on a list," Michael said carefully. "Cost cuts, new markets, that sort of thing." Henry looked out the window, hands clasped behind his back. "Change forced too early hides the truth," he said. "I don't need quick wins. I need honesty." Michael hesitated. "About what, exactly?" Henry turned. "People destroy themselves when they think no one important is watching," he replied. "I'd like to see who does what when they believe the system protects them." Michael understood then. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was an audit of character. Over the following months, Henry watched quietly from a distance. He read reports, reviewed internal complaints, noted which executives spoke about ethics and which only spoke about image. He noticed one name appearing more than others in mid-level escalation summaries: Ethan Cole. Ambitious, rising, praised for drive, occasionally flagged for harsh interpersonal style, and another name, often next to his, Lydia Blake, sharp, political. Frequently copied on complaints about others, never on complaints about herself. Henry didn't smile. He didn't frown. He simply documented. When Grace's name appeared for the first time in an internal incident, logged not as an employee, but as someone being described in HR language she would never see, Michael flagged it. He sent Henry a summary. Henry read it once. A spouse being framed as unstable. A pattern of financial dependence and control. A colleague destroying legal mail meant for her. Michael's message was simple. "I think this touches your personal life." Henry leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He felt nothing like shock. He felt confirmation. "What do you want me to do?" Michael asked on their next call. "Follow procedure," Henry said. "But don't protect titles, protect the truth." "Even if it's your son-in-law?" Michael asked carefully. Henry's voice didn't change. "Especially then." When Elena forwarded the compiled evidence, bank transfers, emails, security footage, Michael read it thoroughly, then sent Grace the message. I've seen some of what you've gathered. We should talk. He did not mention Henry. He did not mention majority ownership. Grace didn't reply immediately, but she didn't block him either. That was enough. Michael kept Henry updated not on the emotional details, but on the facts. She's methodical, Michael said. Careful. She's not making wild accusations. Everything she claims, she backs with something. Henry closed his eyes briefly, picturing the little girl who used to sit at his kitchen table organizing her school papers by subject. She always was, he murmured. As the evidence solidified, Michael proposed the next step. We can handle this quietly through HR, he said, or we can address it formally in front of leadership. Both are risky in different ways. Henry considered that for a long moment. This isn't just about her marriage, he said finally. It's about the kind of people leading this company. If they treat their own spouses like this when they think no one important is watching, what do you think they'll do to people with less power? Michael nodded. So we confront, he said, in a setting where they can't pretend they didn't know better. Henry agreed. He didn't want a spectacle. He wanted a record. As Henry ended the call, his phone buzzed with an unread message, a photo Grace had sent earlier, of a simple bouquet on a grave. No context, just stone, flowers, grass. He looked at it for a long time, then he whispered, to no one in particular. All right then. The next morning, an urgent meeting notice went out to key staff. And Ethan Cole, still believing the company was his path to power, checked his calendar and smiled. Everyone in management and key operations to the main conference room. Mandatory. The message hit Ethan's phone like a jolt. An emergency meeting. No agenda. No explanation. This is probably about the expansion, Ethan said, straightening his jacket. He glanced at Lydia. Stay close. It'll look good if we walk in together. Lydia smoothed her blouse, slipped her hand lightly onto his arm. Always, she said. Somewhere else in the city, Grace's phone lit up with a separate email. Mrs. Grace Cole, Reed. As a registered shareholder through Reed Holdings, and as the complainant in an internal ethics review, you are invited to attend today's leadership session. Your presence is requested as an observer and, briefly, as a witness. Michael Grant, acting CEO. She read it twice. Shareholder, observer, witness. She closed her eyes for a moment, then got dressed. It wasn't normal for a spouse to be in a room like that, she knew. But as both a complainant and a small shareholder, she fell into an uncomfortable but legitimate category the company could no longer ignore. The conference room filled quickly. Senior managers took their seats. Department heads lined the sides. HR and compliance representatives sat closer to the front. Phones buzzed quietly as people speculated. Grace walked in alone. She did not sit next to Ethan. She did not stand with HR. She took a chair along the side wall, where she could see everyone, including the man she had once believed would protect her. Ethan saw her and frowned, confused. What is she doing here? Lydia followed his gaze, then dismissed Grace with a tiny shrug, as if swatting away a fly. Margaret wasn't in the room. This wasn't her territory. This was corporate ground. At the head of the table stood Michael Grant, expression neutral. Thank you for coming on short notice, Michael began. Before we address the internal matters on today's agenda, there is an important introduction to make. The room shifted. Chairs creaked. Whispering stopped. Michael continued. Please welcome the majority owner of this company, Mr. Henry Reed. A man stood near the back, where most had assumed he was just another observer. Plain suit, calm expression, familiar posture. Grace's heart jolted. Her father? Henry walked to the front with steady, unhurried steps. He did not look theatrical. He did not pose. He simply existed in a way that changed the room. Ethan's smile fell away. Lydia's hand slipped from his arm. That's, Ethan breathed, eyes narrowing. That's your father? He looked back at Grace, finally connecting details he had never cared to ask about. Grace held his gaze for a moment, then looked away. Henry nodded to the room. I'm not here to talk about quarterly performance, he said. I'm here because I believe numbers mean nothing if the people behind them are rotten. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Michael spoke again. We are conducting an ethics review involving financial misconduct, reputational risk, and abuse of power, he said, The complainant is present with her counsel's consent. The individuals named are also present. Ethan's stomach dropped. Before we proceed, Michael added, I want to be clear. What you are about to see and hear is being used with the express permission of Mrs. Grace Reed and our legal team. This is a closed session and part of an internal investigation. He nodded to the IT technician. The lights dimmed slightly, the screens lit up. Bank records appeared first. Side-by-side charts showing the joint account balances over time. Transactions authorized by Ethan, all flowing to one external account. The name on the receiving account appeared in bold. Lydia Blake. A low murmur spread. Ethan shifted forward. There's an explanation for that, he started. You'll have a chance to respond, Michael said evenly. For now, you will listen. Next came emails. On screen, Lydia's messages appeared with precise timestamps. I'm concerned about his wife's instability. She has been interfering with his focus. If this continues, it could affect his performance here. Every complaint was followed by internal notes, all marked unsubstantiated, but carefully filed. Elena, seated near the front, watched quietly. Pattern of discrediting a non-employee with no avenue to defend herself, Michael summarized. Filed by someone with influence over the subject's advancement. No one spoke. Then the audio played. The graveyard. Ethan's voice filled the room, unmistakable. You're uneducated, Grace. Just like her. She was nothing. And so are you. Lydia's voice followed, light and cutting. This is where women like her end up, raising more of themselves. Margaret's line, cold and dismissive. You can't give what you never had. The room went utterly still. Several people glanced at Grace. She did not look at the screen. She stared straight ahead, unmoving. Ethan went pale. That was a private humiliation on sacred ground. Michael cut in. Spoken by a senior manager and a key staff member who represent this company everywhere they go. Finally, the security footage. Lydia alone in the office. Grace's name on the envelope. The law firm's logo. The flame. The letter appeared on the screen in scanned form. Notice to Mrs. Grace Reed regarding shareholder registration through Reed Holdings. Mail tampering. Destruction of a legal notice meant for a beneficial shareholder, Michael said. On company property. By someone in a position of trust. Lydia stood abruptly. I never told him to move the money, she said quickly, voice shaking. He did that on his own. You just filed complaint after complaint about his wife, Michael said, and burned legal mail addressed to her. She turned to Ethan, desperate now. Tell them I was trying to help you. Tell them. Ethan stared at her, horrified. You said she'd only hold me back, he muttered. You said. Henry raised a hand. The room fell silent. I have watched enough, Henry said quietly. Not angry, not triumphant, just done. He looked from Lydia to Ethan, then briefly to Grace. A company cannot be led by people who treat their own spouses and shareholders as disposable. If they despise accountability in their personal lives, they will eventually destroy the people under them here. He turned to Michael. You know what to do. Michael nodded once. Effective immediately, he announced. Ethan Cole is suspended pending termination proceedings and legal review of financial misconduct. Lydia Blake is terminated for cause based on evidence presented. Both are barred from company property until further notice. No one applauded. This wasn't entertainment. It was consequence. Grace stood quietly. Michael gestured to her. Mrs. Reed, is there anything you want to say for the record? He asked. Grace walked to the front. Her voice when she spoke was steady. You called me uneducated, she said, looking at Ethan. You said I was nothing. You tried to keep me in the dark, even about what belonged to me. She let the silence breathe. I watched. She continued. I learned. And then I wrote everything down. That's all. She stepped back. No speech about revenge, no gloating. Henry's eyes softened for just a second. The meeting ended. The real dismantling had only begun. The courtroom doors closed with a sound that felt like the last page of a chapter. Not loud, not dramatic, final. Grace stood at the front beside her lawyer. Daniel Wright, calm, focused, a man who disliked theatrics as much as she did. Her hands rested loosely at her sides. Across from her, Ethan Cole sat rigid, his suit slightly looser than before, his jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. Behind him, Margaret Cole clutched her purse strap like it could anchor her to the life she thought she controlled. Lydia was there too, on a separate bench, called as a witness but no longer aligned with anyone. The judge entered. Everyone rose. Everyone sat. Silence wrapped the room. This was not a boardroom. This was not a family dinner. This was a place for record. Daniel rose first. He did not pace. He did not raise his voice. He moved with the same deliberate calm Grace had been raised on. "Your Honor," he began. "This case concerns not only the dissolution of a marriage, but a sustained pattern of financial abuse, reputational harm, and deliberate concealment of the petitioner's legal rights." He handed up a binder, Exhibit A, joint account statements, obtained with proper authorization and verified by the financial institution. Numbers appeared on the court's monitors. Withdrawals, transfers, all initiated by Ethan, all directed to accounts tied to Lydia Blake. Ethan stared straight ahead, jaw working. Daniel continued. Exhibit B, internal emails from the respondent's workplace provided lawfully through the company's compliance office, showing a coordinated attempt to portray Mrs. Reed as unstable and obstructive, despite her not being an employee and having no direct interaction with those departments. The judge leaned forward slightly. Exhibit C, audio recordings documenting verbal and emotional abuse, including at the gravesite of Mrs. Reed's late mother. Ethan flinched visibly as his own words echoed again. "You're uneducated, Grace. She was nothing, and so are you." Margaret closed her eyes briefly, as if she could block out the sound. Finally, Exhibit D, security footage showing Miss Blake destroying a legal letter addressed to Mrs. Reed from a law firm representing a holding company in her name, a letter notifying her of her status as a shareholder in the respondent's company. The footage played, the envelope, the bin, the flame. The judge watched without interruption. Lydia was called to the stand. She walked carefully, no longer in the expensive sheath dresses she'd once worn to company dinners. Her clothes were plain now, neutral. She kept her eyes down. Under oath, her confidence had nowhere to hide. "Did you receive money from Mr. Cole?" Daniel asked. "Yes," she said, voice tight. "Did you understand those funds came from a joint marital account?" "Yes." "Did you ever speak with Mr. Cole about his wife being, in your words, a liability or dead weight?" "Yes." "Did you destroy a letter addressed to Mrs. Reed from the law firm representing Reed Holdings?" A pause. "Yes." "Why?" Lydia swallowed. "Because if she knew she had shares," she said quietly, "she wouldn't be so easy to move out of the picture. And Ethan wanted less complication." Ethan turned toward her, stunned. "That's not what you—" The judge raised a hand. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Cole." Margaret was called next. She clasped her handbag as if it might give her courage. "Mrs. Cole," Daniel said, "did you ever encourage your son to distance himself from his wife?" "I was protecting him," Margaret replied. "She wasn't suitable. She embarrassed him. She didn't belong in his world." "Did you witness repeated public humiliations?" he asked, "including at your own dining table and at the gravesite of Mrs. Reed's mother?" Margaret's eyes flickered. "I thought she was overreacting," she said. "We were just being honest." "Honest," Daniel repeated. "About her being nothing?" Margaret's lips pressed together. She didn't answer. Sometimes silence convicts louder than confession. Ethan finally took the stand. He tried to regain the smoothness that had once worked in presentations. It failed under oath. "I made mistakes," he said. "I was under pressure. Work was intense. I felt judged all the time." Lydia understood that. "My mother just wanted what was best for me." "Is that why you called your wife uneducated and nothing at her mother's grave?" Daniel asked calmly. Ethan's throat bobbed. "I lost my temper," he said. "It was private. I didn't know she was recording." "So," Daniel said, "your main regret is that you were recorded?" Ethan hesitated. "That's not what I—" "Did you tell Miss Blake that your wife was holding you back?" "Yes, but—" "Did you authorize transfers from your joint account to Miss Blake without informing your wife?" "Yes," he muttered. "Did you ever tell your wife about the shareholder notice sent to her through Reed Holdings?" "No, I didn't think it mattered." "Did you benefit from her silence and her belief in you, even as you were taking from her?" Ethan's shoulders sagged. "Yes," he whispered. The ruling came with no dramatic pause. The judge spoke with the clarity of someone who had seen versions of this story too many times. "Divorce is granted," the judge said. on grounds of financial misconduct and emotional cruelty. Grace's chest rose, then fell. All marital assets wrongfully transferred are to be returned to Mrs. Reed, the judge continued. Additional restitution will be determined based on the value of the diverted funds and any profits derived from them. Ethan's head dropped. Given the substantiated pattern of abuse, the judge added, a restraining order is approved, effective immediately. Mr. Cole is to have no direct contact with Mrs. Reed outside of legal counsel. The gavel struck once. It was done. As people began to stand, Ethan moved faster than anyone expected. He crossed the short distance to where Grace was gathering her things and dropped to his knees. Grace, he said, voice cracking. Please. I can fix this. I can change. I didn't know it would go this far. Margaret stumbled after him, pride shattered, her knees hitting the floor as well. I was wrong, she whispered. I see that now. I was just protecting him. Please, forgive us. Give us one more chance to make it right. For years, Grace had imagined apologies that never came. Now they were on the floor in front of her. She finally turned. She looked down at them, not with rage, not with triumph, with clarity. No, she said softly. One word, calm, absolute. You're not on your knees because you're sorry, Grace continued. You're on your knees because you lost. She stepped around them. No speech, no lecture, no mercy she did not genuinely feel. Outside the courthouse, the consequences continued. Ethan's termination became official. No company of that size wanted the liability attached to his name now. Recruiters stopped returning his calls. Friends who once bragged about knowing him stopped replying. Lydia's reputation followed her out the door. No one wanted a documented mail destroyer and complainant manipulator near their clients. Margaret's social circle disappeared. Invitations dried up. The same people who used to praise her strength now whispered about her cruelty. Grace stepped onto the courthouse steps, sunlight warming her face. Daniel stood beside her. You won, he said. Grace didn't answer right away. Winning didn't feel like fireworks. It felt still, clean. She thought of her mother, of the grave, of Henry, sitting quietly through meetings he could have dominated, choosing instead to let the truth speak first. Her phone buzzed. A message from Henry. Come home. We should talk properly now. Grace smiled. Justice had been delivered. But something else was waiting, not in a courtroom, not in a boardroom, but at a kitchen table where truth had always lived. The drive to her father's house felt different this time. Grace wasn't escaping. She wasn't hiding. She was arriving. Henry Reed's home looked the same as always. Modest from the outside, quiet street, no hint of the influence he wielded. He opened the door before she could knock twice. He didn't say, I told you so. He didn't say, I knew it. He just pulled her into a careful embrace, like he was afraid she might break and also certain she wouldn't. When they sat at the worn kitchen table, Henry poured tea, just as he had when she was 11 and lost her mother. You never needed my money, he said quietly. Grace looked up. You needed the truth, he finished. The words landed softly, but they carried the weight of years. You could have told me you owned the company, she said. You could have warned me. Henry nodded. I could have, he agreed. But then you'd always wonder if you stood up for yourself, or if I did it for you. I needed you to see what they were without my shadow, and I needed the world to see what you are, without my name. Grace thought about the graveyard, the conference room, the courtroom. I'm angry with you a little, she admitted. You're allowed, he said. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Grace exhaled. Thank you, she added, for being there when I was ready. Henry smiled faintly. I never doubted you'd get there, he said. I only worried what it would cost. In the weeks that followed, life did not go back to normal. It moved forward. Grace moved into a new place, not huge, not flashy, but hers. The furniture was simple, the rooms were quiet, the silence felt different now. It wasn't emptiness, it was space. Messages poured in after the court records, and the internal investigation leaked into the public domain, some from women she'd never meet, some from advocacy groups, some from journalists. One day, Henry forwarded her an email from a media outlet. They want to interview you, he said, on record. You can say no. Grace read it carefully. Do you think I should? She asked. Henry shrugged gently. I think you should do whatever lets you sleep at night. She thought about all the women whose names would never appear in a boardroom slideshow. Women who had no recordings, no investigator, no father with controlling interest hidden in plain sight. I'll do it, she said. But not as a scandal, as a warning, and a map. The studio was small but professional. A simple chair, soft lights, a camera, a host whose questions were prepared but open enough to let Grace lead. Grace Reed, the interviewer began. People have started calling you a symbol of quiet strength. What would you say to women watching who feel unseen in their own homes? Grace took her time. I'd say this, she replied. Silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's observation. Sometimes it's how you survive while you gather what you need. The camera stayed on her. The problem is when silence becomes the only thing you have, she continued. I didn't win because I turned cruel. I won because I got honest with myself first, and then with people who could actually help. She didn't mention her father's wealth. She didn't mention ownership. She talked about evidence, about patterns, about the moment you finally believe your own perception more than someone else's excuses. Across the country, across the world, women watched on phones, laptops, quiet TVs and quiet kitchens. Some nodded, some cried. Some, for the first time, opened a notebook and wrote a date at the top of a blank page. Later that evening, Grace stood alone at her window, city lights blinking below. Her name appeared in emails now, not as someone's liability, but as someone's reference. She had been asked to consult with a small nonprofit that helped people document financial abuse. She said yes, not as a job, but as a way to turn experience into something less painful. She thought of her mother, of the grave, of the words meant to break her. She smiled faintly. They thought standing there made them powerful, she murmured. They had no idea what they were standing on. Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from Henry, proud of you. Not for winning, for staying yourself. Grace turned off the screen. She didn't need constant reminders anymore. She wasn't running. She was choosing. She caught her reflection in the glass, steady, upright, unburdened. Grace Reed was no longer just surviving. She was living. And somewhere beyond the frame of this story, something new was waiting for her. Not pain, not revenge, but purpose. A future built not on what she endured, but on what she refused to become. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought humility meant ignorance. But the truth is I was watching too. And this time, I wrote everything down. I hope you enjoyed watching this story as much as I enjoyed creating it. If it moved you, please like, share, and comment on the lessons you learned. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments below, and I'll see you in my next video.